Hey, everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Well, hello there, Rob. It's me, Jackie. Wow.
What was that?
That was really special. And it's me, Diana. Hi.
Oh, hey, everybody.
I like that one. That was like your Barney voice.
Yeah, but nobody
Definitely.
knows who Barney is unless they were in our generation. Everyone younger doesn't know Barney.
No,
You know, and that's probably for the best.
he's not around anymore.
Yeah, he faded into oblivion.
There's lots of children's program. There's always lots of children's program. I was surprised how that's like still an ongoing concern. I just thought AI YouTube videos had taken over for children's programming.
It's awesome.
But I guess
Anyway.
not. But
Who knows? We're out of the loop, man.
no, that's true. If it's not Bluey, I don't know what children's entertainment is anymore. But this isn't a children's entertainment podcast. It's a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic related to the field and discuss relevant research articles. And sometimes we bring on a guest. And I had a segue, and I totally forgot to do it. Can I do my segue now?
Yes,
and
please
then I'll
do.
let you choose our guest.
Yeah,
So I was
please
going to
do.
say, there's such a diverse number of children's entertainment,
Oh, wow.
or diverse amount.
I feel like these are maybe not necessary.
No, I like doing a say. It's my thing. It's like my Bob's Burger of the day. You know, you just do it sometimes, right?
Oh, no.
But in any case, that's my segue, because we're going to be talking about diversity in ABA. And to do that, we're bringing on a special guest, Dr. Anita Li. Anita, thank you for letting me do 2 segues before introducing you on the show.
Hello, I'm so special.
That's right. Yeah, 2. Most guests, they get 1 segue.
That's right.
Just 1 and done. You got 2. So, you know.
So it's
whoopee.
a diverse amount of segues too.
There you go.
Oh, there we go. We are really excited to have you here.
Yes.
I'm excited to be here.
Well, let's start with, for folks who don't know you and your writing, could you share a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, so I'm Anita Li. I've done some publications in the area of diversity, and I'm really excited that the field has been really receptive to the work. I'm currently at University of Massachusetts Lowell, and we just found out we're all in Massachusetts. And so I've been here for, I think, 2 years now. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for me.
Oh, good. Now, how did you become interested in writing about diversity as something that you wanted to like research and then, you know, kind of iterate on other research and then do additional research? Like, what was that process like?
So this is going to be a reveal just for ABI Inside Track.
Ooh. Sorry, I
my-
just can't help it. Excited.
My old white male advisor actually was the one who recommended some of these topics. And then I was like, this is actually really cool. And then from there, we kind of just kept doing more things. But one of his, so that was Al Poling, and he, I think, published one of the earlier papers looking at participation of women in behavior analysis. And something he really likes to point out is he has, I think, like maybe 6 or 7 other co-authors on that paper, and they're all women, and he's first author. The one male author is the first author in that paper.
Oh, no.
Oh, you know, it happens.
But it was his first work in that. So I was like, well, I guess that's cool. But we got some ways to go.
Oh, so you had an advisor said, let's write some about this, and you just love the topic and have kept on with it. That's great.
Yeah. And, I think it's been really cool that seeing, he did some of the older stuff, and we were kind of familiar with some of the older papers. And so we updated some of those things, and then we kind of just kept going from there and got creative with some of the things we were looking at. And I was like, yeah, this is a really cool area to actually see and evaluate. I think that's been my area of research, which I'm not good at picking one, but I like researching our field and what's going on in our field.
You know, the longer we do this show, the more I think we're thankful that like somebody decided, you know what, I think I just have to research this, and I'll do the research on that. So somebody else can do something else. You know, you got to free up space for other research on there's a lot of topics, right? So someone's got to do it.
Yeah, there definitely is. I really like behavior analysis, so then I like researching behavior analysts, I guess.
There you go.
It's really cool. And it's one of those things where you're like, well, someone must have those data. You're like, how many people are there that are interested in this, that, or the other thing? And you're like, well, someone must have gathered that information. But no, that's not the way it is. Like, you have to systematically go out and plan to find that information. And so if someone's not doing it, we don't have those answers. So it's really important and needed work, and cool too, because you get to like sift around in all like the different studies and like
it's very reinforcing because the data's all right there. So, we just have to kind of put the puzzle together. And I really enjoy doing this type of work because sometimes it's really surprising and sometimes it's not. And then you're like, okay, well, we have some ways to go.
All right. Well, we have two of your articles that we will be discussing on the show. Dinah, what will we be talking about?
Oh, sure. So we have two articles that were provided to us today by Dr. Li to review, and those include hot off the presses, participation of Latina women as authors in behavior analytic research. That's by Li, Curiel, and Cardoso Sao Mateus. That was published in Behavior Analysis in Practice very recently. And also, Essential Readings in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Behavior Analytic Training Programs by Li, Hollins, Morris, and Gray. And that was published in Behavior Analysis in Practice 2023.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'd love to start with your publication on Latina women in publications. So was there a reason that you wanted, when in looking in publication and publication history, that you honed in specifically on the participation of Latina women in publications versus, say, all individuals from Latin America or just sort of women, or why that specific demographic group?
Yeah, so that's a very easy answer. It's because Behavior Analysis in Practice was doing a special issue focusing on highlighting Latina women researchers in behavior analysis. And so I was like, okay, that, I've done some of the looking at women research, but then we thought, okay, is there a way that we can look at specifically Latina women? And that's kind of where that came from.
Oh, okay. There we go. So sometimes the reason is it's just right there. You had some of the data and there was a need for the publication. There you go.
Yep.
Excellent. So this was an interesting, I think your literature review and the process was kind of different than some of the other reviews that, we've seen in the past when looking at demographic groups and sort of some of the work you did with like the surname analysis. And could you talk a little bit about how you gathered the information that was shared in this paper?
Yeah, so we had the idea. Well, I had the idea of I wanted to look at this, but we weren't sure how to go about executing it because, this is a little bit different. Whereas previous research on just looking at sort of some assuming gendered names is a little bit more straightforward, but here we're kind of guessing at race and ethnicity as well. So I've done a little bit of research because, other people have done this type of work, and I wanted to see what was done previously. And, the short answer is people would review thousands of medical records, which isn't really as applicable as to research in particular. Some people have done some things with like big data and specific software that could extract some of this information, but the methodologies were never very clear on how the software extracted the data, so it wasn't very replicable. But I saw the surname analysis because it was actually through, I think it was some studies looking at different patient data and looking at like demographic data from that. And one of the things they did was the surname analysis. And I thought, well, that actually could be something we might be able to do because, it's a little bit more straightforward. And so we actually used a list of surnames provided from the census. It's pretty old now, but, essentially it has about 600 what they call like highly Hispanic surnames. And we sort of went off that list. And then we tried to buff that list up a little bit by emailing some of the editors in our field. But with the people that actually responded, most of the people that did say they were Hispanic in ethnicity we already had those surnames. So it seemed like a pretty robust list. And the good news with that is we probably are underestimating some of the data. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that was kind of a really unique way of looking at it. And it was really exciting to be able to kind of pivot into sort of this different area.
Yeah. So you had your lists of names, you had your journals that you were looking into. So it was JABA, it's BAP, it was behavior analyst, used behavior analyst, right? I think that's on my list.
Yeah, it used to be this perspective on behavior science. Oh,
yeah, perspectives. Yep. I like the behavior analyst as a title. Perspectives on behavioral science.
I did too.
So hoity-toity, geez.
Yep.
What's this journal about?
JAP and JABA.
Yep. And so you have your list, you have your journals, and then you just got the back issues and you had to flip through and like point to each one and write it on a piece of paper? Or
Oh gosh. I guess one could do that. I don't love doing that. I try to be as efficient as possible with technology. And so and I'm sure there's more efficient ways to do this, but what we typically do is just create this master Excel spreadsheet with all of the authors' sort of name, last name, the title, like sort of everything identifying about the article that we could have. And so then using that, we did sort of return searches from matching our surnames. And then we did a manual kind of analysis of just making sure like what actually matched, what's kind of impartial, and, what's maybe not matching if we didn't do our formulas correct, right, in Excel. And so we did sort of evaluate to make sure that like partial names didn't count. And we were specifically focused on surnames, but we can't tell Excel to only look at surnames when we have both the first and last name in there.
Sure. And so okay, so that was your count. Now, one thing I'm curious to ask about, because, and we don't always talk about this in discussing with authors their papers, but I know just based on timing, we had a pre-publication copy, which you shared, which also had some notes of some updates and some things to suggest. So I was kind of curious. Demographic papers always feel like, well, they're going to be kind of straightforward, right? The surname analysis was a great extra. So you were really trying to capture as much information as possible. And then you're presenting like, here's what we found. These are the numbers. These are the trends. But you had, kind of seeing some of the feedback that you received in writing a paper that could be straightforward or could not be. I'd love to hear sort of about what the writing process of that information was and how that kind of honed what your message or what the results were of the paper.
Yeah, so I was pretty excited. We only had one round of revisions for this paper. So I was like, that's a big
That's
win.
real good.
Yeah, I felt very proud. So we did the surname analysis, but we also did what we call an institutional affiliation analysis. And that was also predicated from previous papers that really looked at where authors were publishing. And we wanted to have both because, surname analysis is one thing, but since this was a special issue about women in Latin America, we also wanted to see if we could provide some of that information and kind of address, what sort of the difference between the United States versus in Latin America. And, as some of the data suggests, and it's probably not surprising, but the majority of peer-reviewed research is published in the United States. So we kind of wanted to make sure we kind of did our due diligence to cover that, to showcase. So some of the feedback that our initial draft got was pretty interesting. This was actually a unique situation. I feel like I'm also like giving like the scoop, but our wonderful associate editor and our reviewer actually had some conflicting opinions on the draft. And yeah, so it was kind of interesting because I've never had that happen before. But we sort of, try to take everything into account of like, so their suggestions while also balancing, these were kind of two perspectives. One person kind of talked about how, well, the results actually seem pretty good. I think one of the things we found is that in behavior analysis and practice, there's like a 400% increase. But our paper initially kind of talked about like, oh, there's still a lot of work to be done here. And, one person kind of mentioned, well, actually, like, this is pretty good. It's 400%. And then, the other person kind of mentioned like, oh, actually, like, we should really highlight, like, what are the factors kind of contributing to some of the lack of participation and things like that, too.
Mm-hmm. Percentages are,
right. And that's one thing I did. I don't know if I think I sent you some of the revisions, but one thing we did add in there was like, yeah, the percentage sounds really good because like 400%, but the actual numbers are pretty low. And so what we did there to highlight was, I think like the 400 increase was like, it went from some single digit number
like
to
1 to 400, right?
0 to 4.
No, 1 to 4 is 400%.
Right.
Yeah,
it was
you're
something.
right.
It wasn't, I think let's see.
It wasn't that, but it was a fairly low number.
It was like a low number to like 85 Latina authors that we found.
Okay, it's like 19 to 85 or something like that.
Yeah. Actually I found it's 13 to 67 authors, which was a 400% increase. So it's only 67 authors in like the most recent year. And so to give some context to that, I actually went through one issue of Behavior Analysis in Practice and counted every single author.
I saw that.
Very fun. But that one issue I counted had like 90 something authors. And so, yes, it's a 400% increase. But if you think about, there's 4 issues published a year, assuming they're all unique authors, that's like 400 authors a year.
Yeah.
So, the absolute numbers are still actually quite low. And so I think we try to do percentage just to give some comparison, but our methodology wasn't perfect. And, we really probably underestimated some, we definitely underestimated some of these numbers. And so percentage isn't always the best thing to sort of use as that point of comparison either.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I mean, it does tell a story of growth. So that's positive.
Yeah.
But the context of, hey, percentage, 1 to 4 was a 400% increase, right? That wasn't what we had or what you found.
Right.
But still, it can be misleading when you're looking at overall percentage of authors. So that is a good point to make. Were there any other trends in the data that you found to be really exciting or disheartening?
Some of the trends were a little slower than I expected. So, in particular, in JM, we saw there was kind of a higher cumulative numbers, which I actually expected a little bit more because I know at least in Mexico and Brazil, there's a pretty high density of like basic researchers doing a lot of EAB work. So I was a little bit surprised that that number wasn't higher because in that area, I would actually expected maybe more participation of Latina people. And then Perspectives of Behavior Science, it was fairly low, but I also feel like maybe that's a journal that I don't feel like there's as many issues within that. So then when you're looking at cumulative number, right, that's kind of also hard to compare like apples to oranges.
Yeah. I feel like more like single author publications as well in Perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know the higher numbers in BAP, I mean, that to me just sort of like made sense, kind of a face value of like looking at an issue of BAP or looking at the list. It's a lot of practitioners. It's a lot of newer researchers, because it is so much on the practice. So if you have something that's of value to the community of, hey, here's a cool idea, try this out or check this out, you can, you see some good publications there, which is, I think, why it's kind of such an exciting journal. But I would also expect to see, as demographics change in the country as a whole, that's probably the first place and the biggest place you'd see the change. It did seem like the data bore that out, though my hypothesis as to why may be way off base, but that it made sense.
Yeah, and I think too with, BAP publishing that special issue on police brutality, I think we're definitely seeing a journal that's very friendly to sort of issues within diversity and race and social issues. And so I think that probably contribute, I have a lot of publications in BAP probably for the same, because some of the previous papers I published, so I'm trying to think of which one. I know I published one paper about, it might have been actually my gender wage gap paper. Mm-hmm. I submitted it to a journal that was not, I think Behavior Analysis Practice is where it is currently, but I submitted to a different journal and it was rejected right away because the editor basically said, we don't publish that kind of paper. So, I feel like there's definitely this, people kind of see these things and they're like, well, of course, but, when you're going through the editorial process, there's definitely this sense of like, oh, this isn't like quote unquote real research, like this isn't really applicable. This isn't science or something like that. Mm-hmm. But if no one's doing it, like how can we evaluate and see your progress in the field?
Right. It's
yeah. I think you're right. Is that BAP is really looking to ensure that we're getting those broader types of topics and questions answered or at least addressed via publications, and I think that's a really worthy cause and undertaking.
I think people are interested in this type of research and reading it. And, I tend to like to write shorter papers. It's great for me. It's great for the audience. And so I think it's definitely like, in terms of expanding readership, it's helpful for the journal too.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Sorry, just to build upon what your hypothesis was, that there's increased diversity in our country, we would hopefully therefore continue to see increased diversity through publication. But I feel like those are some important questions that arise when you start to look at the publication numbers here. Is are we seeing the same levels of demographic diversity continue in a pathway from entrance into graduate school all the way through to seeing your name in print, right? Or is there attrition along the way, which could be potentially problematic, right? Or even insidious if folks are working on projects or research that then somehow don't end up making it into publication, or they get, somehow like not included in the author's list or things like that, right? So I'm not saying that any of that's happening, but I would want to have like those numbers too, to me, right? Like what numbers do we see in terms of entrance into graduate school for a whole host of identifications and continuance therein? Do people stick with it? Do they end up going to doctoral programs? Do they end up getting published research out of the whole process?
Yeah, I definitely think that's an example of something that would be great to have data on, but it's so difficult to have that, right? Because then you have to follow. Maybe we could have like one cohort that we do that with, but I definitely do think there's like in terms of how many people go to graduate school and choose academia, as Jackie probably knows, it's not that many people. And part of it is there's not as many tenure track positions or teaching positions. The salaries aren't as competitive as people think, because I think someone told me that as professors, we get paid in prestige, right? It sounds like really fancy and like, wow, but we're not actually paid a lot.
we get paid in flexibility.
Exactly.
Right? That's it. Not in dollars.
Nope. So yeah, I think already from that, you don't see as many, but it's also a little bit sad because I do think it's really valuable to have academics that are BIPOC and to have diverse perspectives, because I think that really does help with like training programs and students. Yeah. But then academia in itself is not sometimes a great place to be. Of course, it's also a place that is very biased. And there's a line from a book that I can't source right now, but they call it the whitewaters of academia, because so many systems and policies are in place are there that
your quote in there was just, I was like, oh damn, like that's such a great
I read that, I was like, I need to put that in there. Yeah. Like that's so good. So it's difficult, and I've tried to tell some of my students of diverse backgrounds like explicitly, like, oh, you would do really well in a PhD program, but at the same time I also feel sort of like pressure to say, well, it's also hard to be in academia and to pursue their PhD programs. Like maybe they don't want their lives to be like this, because, so I go back and forth a lot between that, where I want to really see more of that diversification and get more people interested in the PhD program. But at the same time, I feel a little bit guilty because academia sometimes isn't a safe place for a lot of students of color and even women too.
Well, you bring up a really good point there, Anita, in that context of, trying to increase sort of like percentage of publications or diversity in graduate programs. And sort of like the two issues that could be going on, one being these places are intensely biased. These places are not supportive of BIPOC individuals. There are too many barriers. I think you brought up a good point in the article about like language barriers, could potentially be a real hurdle for publications. But then there's also the piece of, and the numbers might be low because people actually get through all the barriers. Everything's great. They're super supported. And they're like, that job? No, thanks. Take that job and fill it. No, I don't want that. I'd rather be something else, something else in the field. And how do you getting all that information? That's going to be hard outside of a survey. And then are people going to answer truthfully? But do you really want a PhD? There's a lot of biased historical reasons they might answer no, even though they feel yes. Right? So that does get really tricky as to exactly what does this say? Like what do these results tell us as a field?
So I'll actually use that as one of the examples of the feedback we got that was sort of at odds with each other. So one person mentioned, well, they have a lot of Latina students and they're not interested in research or academia at all. So I don't want to warp words, but essentially that's okay, right? That people of color don't really want to pursue that route. And the other opinion was, well, that's kind of offensive because they're saying they don't want to choose this route, but is it because they're choosing it or is it because they're not being supportive and seeing that as an option? And it is really difficult, right, to sort of hone in like that idea of choice and empowerment. It's, are you choosing not to go into it because you're really interested in clinical work and doing this type of work, or are you choosing it because you feel like you couldn't survive in an academic setting, which is very nuanced.
Or if you're, from your past experience, you anticipate it's going to be a hostile environment and one that you're, ultimately going to be punished out of, then you're probably not going to want to pursue it in the first.
Yeah, and I've been in both, places where, previously taught in Michigan, and Michigan's pretty homogenous, and I was really the only BIPOC faculty, and it really sucked. I felt really alone, and I felt really sad, and I was a junior faculty, so I didn't feel like I could really say anything about that. And so there was some learned helplessness that I exhibited. And then I had a student of color reach out to me and, basically gave me feedback about how the department's doing in diversity initiatives. And they basically said like, oh, I came to you because you're the only person of color. And I don't really feel like saying this to anyone else. And that was kind of a point where I was like, oh, I really need to be more proactive and think about like my role with some power compared to like students, right, who are suffering. And so then that made me feel a little bit more brave to kind of stand up and say some more things. But I mean, it's difficult, and I felt really guilty that, man, it wasn't just me. It's also like my students of color that are alone and, isolated and things like that too. But moving to Massachusetts, it's so much more diverse here. I feel so spoiled because I look at our program on our cohort, and I'm like, oh my gosh. I remember when I first moved here, I looked at my student roster. I got so excited because of all the ethnic last names I saw, and I was like, oh, it's going to be such a diverse group.
Wasn't just like Chad Jones and Bartholomew Masterson III.
Yeah, there was so many like Asian names, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm so excited. And I remember telling my husband that I was like, yay.
So Anita, you bring up in the introduction to this paper, looking at the U.S. Hispanic population is 18.9% of our total population in the U.S. And then looking at the RBT percentages that identify as, or Hispanics individuals identifying as RBTs is 26%, BCABAs is 20%, but only 11% as BCBAs. And I think that brings up kind of like you were talking about that interesting point of like, why would this percentage not be slightly differently distributed? But I guess that also would raise the question of, is that, what's the distribution for, say, white males, white females, black females? Was there a thought at any point of, rather than doing publications, looking more at sort of like professional demographics? Or was it one of those sort of like, that information is only just now getting published or getting reported, so we're just not going to have the body of information we need to make any, meaningful statements about that information?
Yeah, I think the reason why I sort of bias towards like permanent products is because it's quote unquote like all there, right? I can kind of scoop up what I want to look at, get my sample. I've done survey work as well, but it's so difficult. So, I know Dr. Barres has done, and Hannah Vance has done work with looking at like pay, right, within practitioners, but it's really difficult because it's really based on who's reporting it. And then also when you're trying to do some sort of meaningful analysis in that context, you need a lot of people. And sometimes your sample sizes are going to get so small, especially with the BACB removing their research listserv to recruit responses. And, I think it's worthwhile asking people, but whenever I feel like I write those papers or those paper gets published, you get so much pushback from the reviewers and the editors sort of criticizing and saying, it's such a small sample size, you can't really meaningfully say this. And so you have to put in so much like prefacing of like, well, we're just assuming, but and it sort of weakens the argument a little bit too. But at the same time, it's like, well, yeah, we know it's not the best way, but how can you as editors or the editorial board help us get this information, right? Instead of just sort of poo-pooing and saying it's not enough. But we know we're doing our best, but it's really difficult to get this comprehensive way.
Yeah. I mean, so when it came down to it, you're writing the discussion, it's got to be so hard to say, all right, we have these data, we have these sets, this means blank. We see an increase, which we talked about. Of course, that's great. But Why is the increase? Is it really contextual based on there were just a lot of special issues the past 2 years that just kind of artificially inflated that, and it's going to go back down to some other number in 5 years? Just because we're seeing more names in publication doesn't necessarily mean that barriers to practitioners have been decreased first, in kind of the Latina women demographic. What kind of general statements did you feel comfortable that you could make from that information? Or were there any that you wanted to make, but you felt like just the data wasn't able to support a hypothesis that you still feel strongly about?
Yeah, I think, I really wanted to maybe have more data related to the amount of, I guess, Latina researchers in general, right, relative to other areas. But again, it's difficult to say that when you're in academia, you can also be practicing. So it's not really a either or type of situation. And we saw an increase, which is not really surprising. I think in our field, as it's growing, right, there's such huge growth, you're going to see growth in these corresponding numbers. And so the percentages can be helpful to kind of give that some relative context. But I still think, like, even with just your BACB data, right, there is attrition. Like Anna said, like, we are losing Black and Hispanic RBTs, and they're not going up for their BCBAs. And, maybe that's because they're leaving the field, right? But with such the high number, I don't think it's just because it's leaving the field. I think there's definitely areas that we're seeing people fall through the cracks of maybe not getting the resources, support, and that could be emotional support from their mentors and the organizations to pursue these more leadership roles. And then, of course, that contributes to the future organizations not being very safe or supportive for people to do, right? So it's like this cyclical aspect.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey, everybody. Sorry to pause our discussion with Dr. Li, but I wanted to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QAVA approved. By listening to this episode, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in your show notes and enter in some key information about yourself, as well as information about 2 secret code words that we have from Dr. Li. They're guest secret code words. And the first one, a term near and dear to my heart, ice cream. ICECREAM. Don't put your favorite ice cream. That doesn't count. Just put ice cream, which we can all scream for.
But if you want to tell me it, you can email me at abainsidetrack@gmail.com and tell me your favorite ice cream.
Yeah, that's a separate email, though.
Mine is coffee or mint chocolate chip.
Those are great ice creams. We had a mango the other day at the library. They were having a summer reading kickoff, and we all agreed, let's get mango because it will be refreshing. And it was pretty great. I assumed it would be like too fruity, but it was like great. Mango ice cream was good. Not my favorite, but I'm just putting a plug in for it. Anyway, ice cream. Let's get back to the show. Well, kind of speaking of growth and opportunities, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your other paper on DEI readings in behavior and analytic training programs, which I love these articles. I love any article that gives me a list of like, these are the coolest articles that you should totally read in the field based on this topic, because then you get to play the fun game of checklist. How many of these have I read? How many of these have I assigned? If I haven't, I got to go read them and assign them. So I always appreciate these. So thank you very much for writing this article. I just want like a master list. Oh, I love it. Have you ever seen those like posters you can buy? And like, it's usually like movies, right? And you scratch off the poster.
That's a good idea.
I want that for like the essential DEI articles or the essential behavior analytic articles.
That's a good merch.
I mean,
APBA should do that.
Yeah. Oh my God, they should. Rob's a completionist, so like anything where it's like you can get the full set, then he wants to get the full set.
I love that idea.
Someone suggests like you should probably read these 10 articles.
I'm there.
You know that's what he's about to do. So
if you do read the articles,
I think we might be onto something with the scratch off poster.
It could be a bingo.
And then I think if everyone gets it, then you get a T-shirt.
I love it.
or a sweatband. Because that's smaller and cheaper.
Around your head, like an 80s style.
Yeah.
Okay.
I read all the articles.
I love it.
It says winner on it.
This is a really good idea.
You know what? Okay, there we go. We got to do some ABA Inside Track. I read all the articles merch. I think that's
when you release this episode, you can say we also have merch.
Yeah, right.
I did once research how could you make your own scratch off poster, and it did seem doable.
It is doable.
It seemed like a lot of work for a niche product, but
I love it.
So, in any case, so in this article, but I know one question that kind of came to mind was, how do you think increasing the amount of DEI readings in the training programs does or does not create a more diverse behavior analytic workforce? Because on its face, it seems like, there's nothing wrong. I would see no reason you wouldn't want to be increasing the number of diversity, articles about diversity in our field, looking at different groups. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that we now have more diversity in the group. Like there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence. Kind of, what are your thoughts on that kind of trend overall?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for something like this, I would say I'm hoping it would sort of affect students, right? To see names like theirs reflect in the research they're reading. But I think what would maybe have a larger impact is to the faculty assigning these papers. And I know this is an area that's gotten a lot of attention recently. And I know there's a lot of maybe older or more senior faculty that are really interested in this area, but they don't touch it because they're really afraid. They're really afraid that they're going to get things wrong or they're going to get canceled. And so part of the reason of publishing this was well, here's some examples, right? Here you go. That's very easy. This is what people have said. And the other thing about sort of diversifying the types of authors and researchers is also to add this level of intention for the faculties who are the people in power, right? That are really contributing to what students are learning and perspectives. And I found for myself, that's been really a helpful exercise of even just looking at who am I highlighting? Where do they come from? And, no offense, Greg Hanley is wonderful, but he's going to be cited all over the place, right? What if someone else had a different perspective or doing this type of work, right? That's related. And maybe I should consider adding their paper, or maybe highlighting what they're saying, right? Because with diverse researchers, you're going to get diverse perspectives as well. And I don't really feel like I have to do this as much anymore. Whereas 5 or 6 years ago, I would sort of do that check on myself. And I'm like, ooh, Anita, it doesn't look good. These are all white researchers, or all these are all men, in sort of high positions. And I think even for myself, that's been a helpful exercise of just really thinking about who's in here. And I think now when I assigned articles to my students, I think about that a lot more saliently. And I also think about who are some newer researchers that I can sort of highlight and say these are some really cool people doing this work, and use that as sort of a way to uplift them as well.
Mm-hmm. So Anita, how did you come up with the kind of the essential reading lists? Because I'm guessing you weren't trying to publish this on BuzzFeed. You didn't just write out a listicle real quick. You got to get this published in a peer-reviewed journal. So you need a pretty robust method for getting the 10 best or the most cited, right? So what was that process?
Yeah, so this is again, there's some other authors that have done sort of the essential readings and undergrad behavior analysis and EAB, maybe in ethics. There's sort of these little topical areas. And so we wanted to do DEI. And going into it, we had two thoughts. we're not going to get any like recurring ones, which we're not surprised by, or maybe we will, which is also really good because then we have a nice robust list.
Right.
And the way we did the survey was, we asked some demographic questions, of course, and we were really trying to cast a wide net with this because we did feel like this was going to be one, difficult to get responses for and maybe difficult to get readings for. So we cast a wide net. Some of the questions were even just like, did you read papers related to DEI? Because I think that's, important too. And then if they did, we would ask them, okay, as students, can you tell us what you've read or what was assigned? So that was kind of, everyone, right? We're assuming has been students at some point. So that was a question that would be applicable to everyone. And then if the respondent indicated they also supervise or they taught, we also kind of asked these questions like, do you assign these types of things in your supervision meetings? And then if you're teaching, what kind of things do you assign? And then sort of the last catch-all for everyone is like, what do you feel is essential? Maybe you hadn't read it in school, maybe you're not using supervision or in your assignments. Well, what do you think is essential? So in total, there was really just 3 open-ended questions. And the intention of that, I think we like wrote in our questions, like just like what readings were you assigned? And we just sort of said like, the author or title would be helpful. Like we really didn't need a specific like formal reference, but a lot of people did that. And one of the comments on one of our open answer questions was, this is a lot of work, or like,
Right.
This is a huge ask. And I was like, I know, that's why we were trying to make it easy. And like, you could, we didn't make anything mandatory. But we
Everyone's,
actually
like typing in the DOI number.
like people were like copying and pasting from their syllabus, which I'm like, oh, that's really helpful. But like we were just gonna go through and just see what people said, see if we can make these match. So that was extremely helpful that these people were willing to do that work in providing some of these things. And it was difficult because we were trying to, we didn't say like necessarily within behavior analysis because again, we were just trying to cast that wide net. And I'm assuming in the past, there hasn't been a lot of DEI papers within, ABA. So, of course, people are going to go outside of that. So, so that gave us some list. But even if you can look at the results, like, I think the most reoccurring one was like 8 people said a particular paper. So the numbers were still fairly small. And we didn't do it for everything. I think in some of the other ones, like, it went down to like 3 or as sort of the top numbers. And so, basically what we got is there's a huge range of different papers that people look at and explore.
I appreciated the inclusiveness of the survey because, just reading the title, I'm like, oh, okay, well, you just find like, who are like the 20 coolest professors of behavior analysis in America? And like, hey, send them an email. What are the DEI assignments? And then that's it. That's your list.
The coolest.
The coolest professors,
I love that.
Right? They're so cool. And
That
then
would
you
be
can
a
put
good
yourself on the
BuzzFeed
list too, because you're writing the paper. So, hey, what do I assign? But including supervisors who may or may not be professors, including students as to what have you been assigned in the past, so that you were getting a list of these are things that actually got read, that were on syllabi, rather than just what the cool professors say is the cool DEI research that should be read. It did make for a lot more tables. And it did not, it was a little harder to say, like, these are the definitive awesomest DEI articles, because like you said, 8 to 3, was the most commonly cited number. But it did read like a list of a lot of resources, which I think in many ways made it so much stronger than just like, here's my listicle, 10 great DEI articles. So just thank you for that. That was such a lot of extra work, I'm guessing, for doing it that way.
Yeah, it was, I think Cody, Nicole, and I were working on this paper. And we went back and forth because we're like, I think we wanted to do like, here are the top 10 hits, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But then when we did that, we're like, the numbers aren't that high. And like, like 4 papers had number 4, or actually like 5 papers had 4 citations. So we're like, well, how do we cut off if we're trying to do 10? So then we're like, okay, maybe we'll make this more expansive and see like what the reviewers say. And they were, pretty okay with the numbers. But yeah, it was definitely difficult to kind of say like, if multiple articles have this like as the same citation, I don't feel like we can just cut it after X number because, if your last name occurred in a later part of the alphabet, you didn't make the cut or something like that.
Yeah, right. The poor kids' names start with Z. That's like their
Right.
lifelong story. I appreciated too that that the variety of articles here was really wide ranging with respect to their topic. So while it's noted that many of them were talking about racial diversity, equity, inclusion, there were others that were kind of across the spectrum of other types of diversity. And I think that that's important as well. So I know like the Leland and Stockwell article was on most of these lists, and that's looking at gender non-conforming diversity within the field and how to ensure that we're addressing that well. So that was really nice to see too. It was
I think it's also cool seeing these people sort of do their due diligence of like Warner's actually a great example. They're primarily a practitioner, and right, if I sort of limited this list to sort of just academics, and I would kind of argue there's not a lot of cool academics in this area. I think we still have a lot of work to do.
But,
there's at least 20, I'm sure. I just said so. 20 cool academics.
But Warner published that paper and did this really important work. But, I want to make sure that like their work gets highlighted. And I think this is really cool to see like their paper gets sort of highlighted on this list like repeatedly. And it's not from a traditional like researcher in academia right now, which is
Yeah.
So
great.
I've got 3 cool academics sitting, in our Zencastr window here.
Maybe just 2. I don't count.
You can decide which of the 2 if you want to go that way. I'm not saying it. I said 3. 3 cool. Were there articles in here, and this is, for the academics group, that you saw and said, yep, of course, that's the one, I assigned that one. And then were there any that you felt, I wish this one had been more represented. I found it to be just a slam dunk in my classes.
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the most cited papers is one published by Elizabeth Fong in 2016. And that one I wasn't surprised by because I felt like Liz did so much work ahead of the game. And I remember ABI held this DEI panel once that was like, okay. But Liz, she was running late for this panel, but I remember seeing her run down the sort of the hall to like get to this panel. And I remember thinking, I was like, who is that? And I was like, she's Asian. I was like, she's like, I literally thought that. I was like, she's like me. And I was like, who is that? And that's kind of my first time like knowing about her. And then I sort of looked at all her work and I was like, oh my gosh, like she has done so much work in this area. And I know like, people have kind of talked about me publishing this and I was like, no, pretty late to the game. But there's definitely been people publishing this stuff beforehand. And so I was really happy to see like that's true that, she has been doing this for a long time and her work is still being highlighted a lot. In terms of like papers, I guess this is part of what we were asking for. We're kind of looking at particularly focusing on DEI topics, right, specifically. So I think we kind of missed some papers that were maybe what I call like DEI adjacent, maybe. So like Rocio Rosales has published a lot on looking at like linguistically diverse like families and working with them. And I feel like that paper is one that I'm seeing a lot more like citations towards now, but like that would have been a really cool paper to see right here. But I think at that time, it didn't quite meet like sort of the keyword things we were looking for. And so maybe sometimes people didn't think to kind of include those things because it's not so DEI conceptual focus, but that's like, I think a huge example of like DEI in practice and application.
For me, we actually use a lot of these articles in our graduate coursework, but I had not seen what?
That's a flex.
Oh yeah. I'm too old. I'm like, what does that mean?
You're all cool academics. So you can flex all you like.
I'm there.
Because you're cool.
But I had not actually seen the Korniak article about the discrimination. And so that I pulled out and I was like, ooh, read it and added it to my fall syllabi. So, right, that's how these papers are really helpful. And
that's really cool.
Right? Because it gives us a one-stop shop to be like, okay, where are we? How are we doing? And so that I always appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really exciting to hear. And I think it's like there's definitely a lot of papers here where I'm like, oh, I didn't think about that one, or I'm like, oh, that's cool that that's in there, or okay, that's like interesting how people are using this for that, but not something else. I will say when we first, I tell everyone this story, but when we first started soliciting respondents from this, I was not looking forward to that. And I don't think I explicitly said this to my co-authors. I was just kind of like, you know, that Ben Affleck meme of like him smoking the cigarette outside. Ugh. Like that was how I felt. I was like, I
feel that so strongly whenever I see that meme.
So I actually asked Cody Morris to be like, hey, could you send out the recruitment script? Sometimes I don't like to use social media a lot because it can be very like, it's very
demoralizing.
Like, it can be demoralizing, and sometimes it takes so much energy. And I'm like, I just wanted you to like this. I don't really want to follow up or like communicate. I just like, here you go. But Cody, thankfully, was great, and he was able to sort of recruit and disseminate. So, and Nicole also did it. Actually, Nicole did more of the Facebook posts and like LinkedIn posts and that. But Cody did the teaching with behavior analysis listserv, which I'm glad he did, because are you on that listserv, Jackie?
No, I don't know why.
Because sometimes it's a bunch of old people just sort of bickering about things. But anyway, so we sent it out to them.
Yeah, I was on a listserv at one point, and it was too much. It was taking too much of my emotional time, so I just removed myself. Yep. But maybe it was that one.
It probably was. So Cody sent it out to that listserv, and of course, someone replies like, ugh, like, what does this mean? Or like, what is this asking about? Like,
I actually do. That was a few years ago. And I remember that. I was on the listserv.
Yeah.
And I remember these comments.
This survey, the reason?
I think it might be. You know what's funny? You are right. This survey was the reason I removed myself from the listserv.
I'm sorry, I caused you emotional damage.
The response to the survey.
And I'm just like,
the responses.
The responses were ridiculous.
Yes.
And like uncalled for. And yes, I unsubscribed immediately. I was like, I can't handle this.
So funny. No, yeah, and you can see I actually did a little call out from that. A reviewer actually recommended to do that. We were going to not say anything, and I was like, that will just be a story I'll tell people. Like, I was annoyed. But a reviewer actually said, like, hey, when you were soliciting your responses, you had this issue. You should put that in your paper and say so. I was like, okay. But it was very, like,
It was, and I actually reached out to Cody, and I apologized. For some of the responses, and I was like, this is really disgraceful. And now I'm remembering it didn't I didn't put two and two together.
Oh boy.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. It was.
That is disgraceful.
It was like not surprising because I was like, oh, this is why I didn't want to like deal with this. Right. But it was also like really cool seeing a lot of people respond and like sort of defend and like say, this is it. And I was like, well, that's cool too. But I'm also like, I'm tired. I just want to like,
right.
I just want to collect it. Please just fill out the survey. Let's take this conversation to the survey.
You know what? You just do the survey.
Yeah. That happens, I think, more often than not, where I'm like, okay, y'all have some debate about the but like, why don't you fill out the survey? Let's just use this as data.
I love it. You were asking me, Rob, too. I, too, noted the Cornac one because I also hadn't read it previously. But, Jackie, if you're putting it in your class, then I won't add it to my class. A lot of these I have touched on before. I somehow missed the Felice and Diller, which is about intersectional feminism and behavior analysis. So I'm circling back because I definitely want to read about that for myself.
So I was familiar with that paper, and close colleagues with James Diller are actually going to write a paper together. But I didn't put it together that was him on the paper because I think I met him afterwards, and I saw that paper recently. I was like, that's James. I was like, good job, James. I was like, that's so cool. I didn't realize.
Right on. Yeah, so I'm excited about that. I as a professor, it's always a balance of trying to figure out like which readings am I going to assign and how are they going to, best get it across all of the different things that I want to make sure my students know, while also trying to make sure that they have like a grasp of Cooper and like the principles of behavior, right? So it's like, how do you like balance that? So I find that sometimes I'll pick out one that's like a heavy hitter and I'm like, this is a great article. And then I'll give them supplemental articles as well.
Yeah.
That I'm like,
smart.
Hey, if you want to circle back, these are all here too. And we always say, like, save your syllabi, because someday you won't be in grad school anymore. You will have more time. And, the articles hit different when you're older.
They totally do.
And
Absolutely.
you can go back and you're like, oh, I wasn't ready for this in grad school, but now I am. Oh, and look, here are all these other ones that my professor has recommended. So you really, do people actually pull their syllabi back out? I don't know, but perhaps they do. So if you're a professor like me that's like, oh, I don't want to overwhelm my students, like, pick one, but then you could also like include some as well in the supplemental section so that they have it to look back on later.
I think that's a great recommendation.
I had a student alum email and be like, can you send me every single syllabi that I had? And I'm like,
God.
You graduated
Yes.
like 8 years ago. And he's like, I know. I'm ready now. And I was like, oh.
That's funny. No, I think that's a point that I think sometimes like students aren't really aware of, that sometimes when you're reading these articles in school and you're like, I read it for school, but I don't really get it. And like, they do hit different like later. There's a lot of papers I read in undergrad. I was like, that was like really good. Like, I get it a lot more now than I did before. And I feel like some people are maybe a little embarrassed to sort of admit, like, I just didn't really get it. And I have an undergraduate student right now who, bless his heart, he's so interested in our field. And so he's reading like research articles, he's reading stuff by Palmer, and he's like, I'm so stupid, I don't get it. And I'm like, yeah, I'm like, that makes sense. I'm like, you shouldn't. I said, you probably won't get it in your master's program. I was like, this is, I'm like, I barely get it now. And I feel like now I'm like, oh, I see.
Yeah, exactly. Like, why are we having like 10th graders read Hamlet or whatever? Like,
yeah, exactly. I'm like, I'm like, it's cool that you're reading this, but I don't expect you to retain a lot, or like, you read it for what it is now, you'll get something from it. But later when you go back to it, you're like, oh, like there's so much more, because you'll, right, the basics are really important. Then as you build that fluency and as you sort of apply more things, I think a lot more of this will be a lot more like mind opening too.
One time I had signed an article for multiple years in our basics class, and I was like going over the graph, and then I actually got it during class. Like, I actually then understood what the graph, and I was like, oh my gosh, everyone. And everyone's like,
I love it.
What's happening? I was like, I see it. And I was like, look. And they're like, you didn't get it before. I was like, I thought I did, but obviously not. So that can happen.
That's fantastic.
Right? And I taught the class for like 5 years.
Yeah, it's lifelong learning. No, I definitely have been in those moments where, like, even the stuff I learned in undergrad and these findings my like professors then talked about, now I'll go back and actually read the articles, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. That's a little different than what I took away from it.
Yeah. But that's okay. And you're right. Folks. Like, it is lifelong learning, and we professors can also be good demonstrators of that too, by continually revisiting our syllabi, looking at the types of articles that we're assigning, the authors of those articles, the messages. And, every year I go through and I like revamp. I'm like, how can I make this more diverse? Where's there's a newer version that it's time to bring in? And so by demonstrating that to our students, we can say, hey folks, I just found this new article. It's bringing in all of these important points, and I'm reading it and learning about it along with you. Like, that's going to set them up to have an understanding that they can do that as well. And what you learn in grad school is like one point in time, but the research is going to keep going, and hopefully our field is going to keep moving and progressing forward as well.
I hope so. Feels like it is.
Yeah.
Right. So in some ways, hopefully it'll continue to move that way.
Yeah.
Well, that feels like a good seg to move into the next section, dissemination station. where we do a little summary. So I guess, Anita, based on the results of these papers, based on your work, I mean, things seem like they're moving in the right direction. Is it just we just keep swimming, just keep doing what we're doing, everything's going to be great from here on out? Or are there some other steps that we as individuals, we as a field should be taking to continue to increase diversity in ABA? Kind of like, what are your big picture thoughts after having done all this, done all this research and been publishing on this now?
Well, that's not a difficult question at all. I think when I write these papers, there's kind of a risk, right? Like, especially with the Latina paper, there's been an increase. That's really cool. And what I don't want people to take away from that is like, well, like, we just keep doing what we're doing. It's like, well, maybe like we're doing some things right, but there's always like room for growth. And I think what people really need to think about is like, well, I always sort of use the census as a crutch because I feel like people need something relative to compare it to because, you know, I think people see increases. They're like, well, it's increasing. That's good. But when you consider proportion of the population, right, you know, sort of that equity/equality aspect, it's like, well, we should really see, right, ideally, some semblance of that when you're looking at large numbers. And our field is a large number, but in reality, we just don't. And we probably won't for a little while. And I think that's probably the best demonstration of like, there's a long way to go. And what are some things like we can do to help extrapolate and sort of think about critically like why that is? And the answer isn't simple. And I think a lot of people, I think sometimes people, when they're interested in looking at DEI and reading about DEI papers, they're often very unsatisfied because, you know, there's a lot of prefacing and they're like, well, okay. But yeah, like our society is very complex and there's so many intersectionalities and there's a lot of these confluence of influences. Like it's never going to be simple. And I would rather people sort of just start to think about this stuff more critically and seeing like what are these little small changes and interactions that they can do that maybe would help support one another, right? And also try to, you know, like that the corny Skinner quote, like make the world a better place for like not just ourselves, but you know, we want to be good people in doing that, what that might look like.
So last question, if someone who, you know, understands the complexity, there's still a lot of work to do, they say, okay, I don't know anything about DEI. I want to read an article and then I want to have an activity that goes with that article. Which from the list, or maybe not from the list, might you recommend? And then what should they do? Because they can't all go make a podcast about the article they read, because that's what we do. I guess they could.
ABA Insight Track.
They could just listen. Maybe something active though, rather than passive. You know, they read it and they should what with it? Like, what would be kind of a good activity you'd recommend for a student or someone new to DEI research?
Oh my God. Why would you ask the hardest questions at the end? We're going to spend the whole time just talking about these two questions.
Oh, you can write a journal, you know, of your, I don't know, write your reflection thoughts. I mean, right, it doesn't have to be too complicated. They don't have to do a thesis on it.
I think what I would recommend, and I hate that you asked me this question because I can never say her last name because I just know I say it wrong every single time. But it's not below. I know it's not below.
Oh, Lauren Beaulieu.
Okay. Beaulieu. Okay. Thank you. I've been taught, and okay. Beaulieu and Jimenez Gomez's article. And then there's one where Jimenez Gomez is the first author, and then it's Beaulieu. I think one of those two papers are probably one of your best like starting points, especially for someone who's really intimidated about DEI work in general, because I think theirs is a really good place to start because it focused so much on that self-reflective component and sort of how that might influence your practice. And I would consider very gentle. And I think like that's really the first step of like, I think sometimes people want to be told like, what should I do to others to be like sensitive? But part of it is sort of recognizing where you come from and the hardships you've experienced and how you wish things were different and so forth. And I think those would be probably one of the best papers to really start. And you really use that as that opportunity of identifying like your self-reflective, like what were parts of your life that were difficult, right? Your identity as a woman, your identity as, you know, someone who moved to the South, who did not come from the South originally, like all of these things contribute to that. I think sometimes people really just focus in on race and ethnicity, but it can be things like C.C.S. It can be, you know, your physical abilities and so forth. And I think that probably helps a lot in terms of making people really see and kind of take that perspective of why this content is important and how it's also just not limited to what, you know, superficially people think DEI is.
Ooh, all right. Those are good. Those are great recommendations. I read those and I did find them to be a really awesome, like kind of soft entry into the faith of DEI. So
And I think, people are a lot more restorative in terms of DEI work right now, which I think is really important because people will mess up. I've messed up and I've said things that weren't. And I talk about those and I tell my students, like, oh, I messed this up and that was really embarrassing. But like, it's hard, but you still want to keep going, right? Because otherwise, if you don't, then you're not doing anything towards it. It's a shaping process.
Right.
Well, Dr. Anita Li, thank you so much for coming on the show today, for sharing all your insights as one of the cool academics. It was great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great
if
to be able to talk to all of you all.
If folks want to reach out for recommendations for articles, or if they have one that they think would be a good one to add to the list, is there a place that they can get in touch with you, or the list is closed? No. The list is that's the list.
No, I mean, this is kind of like the cool thing about this type of work is if you're interested in adding to this list, right? Cite the paper and say, like, actually, this is what they said, but here are some other essential readings. And, I think it's sort of this nice way of like ongoing contributions. And right, regardless of, you don't have to be a fancy hoity-toity PhD to do that. Like, you might be aware of things that we're not aware of. And so I highly recommend you can contact me through my university email, which is Anita_Li@uml.edu. And if you're ever interested in talking about stuff like this or just for resources, I'm always open to those emails.
Once again, thanks to Dr. Anita Li for coming on the show and talking so wonderfully and coolly about her research on diversity in ABA. But before we wrap up, let's move to the last section of our show, pairings. Diana, take it away.
All right. Pairings is where I tell you about other episodes you might want to check out if you enjoyed this one. And I have several that I'd like to mention for you in no particular order, not even numerical. They include episode 94, where we discuss gender diversity in ABA with Erin Donovan and Kristen Lancaster. Episode 45, Women in Behavior Analysis with Devin Sundberg. Episode 100, History of ABA with Gina Green. Episode 104, Culturally Competent Assessment with Liz Hughes-Fong. Episode 71, Cultural Responsiveness with Salandi Forte. Episode 246, Trans-Affirming Care with Werner Leland. And finally, episode 128, Diversity and Inclusion with Adrian Bradley and Kat Jackson. Quite a selection, star-studded.
I will say, if you look at the list of like the top 10 most cited DEI papers in programs or supervision in Dr. Li's paper, there were 2 books and 8 articles. Of those 8 articles, we have talked about 5 of them on the show. So let's add it to the list. Let's add it to the list. The last they're all cool, but like the last most cited grad DEI papers. And we'll just have an episode and just wrap it up. We'll close the loop. We'll get the checklist. We'll get the poster and the headband and t-shirt.
Okay. Headband, the winner headband.
Winner. Sorry, I misunderstood you. And finally, I also like to recommend a snack to go with the episode. So you get 2 snacks today to enjoy. They are potato salad and corn on the cob. And those will make sense when you hear your very last code word.
You know what I would have picked? Mac and cheese.
I had that, but then I really wanted the potato salad, and I was like, potato salad and mac and cheese are too similar.
Yeah, they are. Okay.
Yeah, so.
All right. Well, thank you, Diana.
And
that brings us to the end of the show. We want to say thank you all so much for listening. Thanks again to Dr. Anita Li. If you like ABA Inside Track, why not leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast player? And hey, you should subscribe to the show so that you can get a new episode every single week. You can email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com with your favorite pairings dishes, I guess, if you'd like, or your favorite DEI articles. You can also go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all the articles discussed on this episode, as well as to all of our previous episodes. If you want even more ABA Inside Track goodness, why not head on over to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe at any level, but if you subscribe at our $5 and up levels, you'll get some extra bonuses, episodes ahead of time. You'll get to vote on our polls for book clubs and listener choice episodes, which we do every season. You'll get discounts on CEs, and if you subscribe at the $5 level, you'll get free CEs for our listener choice episodes, which we do seasonally. And at the $10 level for our book club episodes where we talk 2 hours about a book. Maybe we'll do some DEI books from the list. Who can say? And you also get free CEs for subscribing at that level. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And some final thanks before we get to that last secret code word. Thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. And finally, that last secret code word, barbecue, which you can just write BBQ because honestly, we couldn't remember how to actually spell it. So BBQ.
I know how to spell it. I know how to spell it. But
Jag knows how to spell it.
I didn't want to ruin it. I didn't want to ruin it for everyone. BBQ's better.
BBQ. And if you like BBQ, we hope you get to have sometime this summer. I know I would like one. So let's wrap up the show. Maybe go get one. I want one BBQ, please.
BBQ, please?
We'll be back.
I forgot. Wait, I forgot. I forgot episode 243, Research Applications in DEI with Sarah Lachago. Can't believe I forgot that.
That should have gone in the pairing. This is the last section.
The barbecue section.
Where we talk about barbecues. Yeah, I know. I love that episode. So don't forget to listen to Dr. Lachago's episode too. Add it to pairings. And now it's time to go. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.